journalist. So we choose somebody who's an inspirational journalist who other women in the industry can hopefully learn from and advance their careers. And we're also very, very lucky on this occasion that Eva Simpson, the columnist and PR guru, is going to be interviewing Poorna for us. So I'm going to quickly hand over to Eva now. Thank you both very much for giving us all your time, and I will let you begin the conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you, Alison. As typical with Zoom, I seem to have lost sight of everyone, so I'm just trying to find you guys again. Apologies, Poorna.
That's okay, don't worry.
Where have you all gone?
It doesn't get any easier, does it, even after 3 years since COVID started?
I apologise.
The technical side of it all can still be a bit of a challenge. Are we hiding behind a tab? Sometimes that happens.
This is what I'm thinking. Yeah. Sorry, guys.
Don't worry, it's all absolutely fine.
Alison and Poorna, just freestyle for now.
For a bit. So Poorna, why don't we, while we're waiting for Eva, why don't you just tell us, Poorna, what you've been working on so far this year? I think people would be really interested to know.
Okay, so I am currently working on a book. It's my second fiction, and I'm very glad this is on Zoom because I have not washed my hair in a few days because I have to deliver a manuscript in about a week. So so that's mainly what I've been working on.
Does it follow from your first novel? Is it very much in the same genre?
No, well, okay, it's the same genre, I would say, in that it's modern women's fiction,
Yes.
but it's not. Someone asked me if it was a sequel, and I was like, no, it's not. So it's a completely different type of story, and it's I think I've learned a lot of lessons from writing my first one. So definitely I think this time around it's been a bit easier because I've been a bit less self-conscious about writing it. So yeah,
I think that's really interesting what you say about self-consciousness in writing fiction, because I imagine on this call there'll be loads and loads of journalists who have held that dream that one day they might be able to make the step into fiction. So I think a lot of us hold that dream. And sometimes it's self-consciousness that holds us back because it's that bit more artistic, isn't it?
It is. And also, so I've written non-fiction as well as fiction, and non-fiction is definitely easier. I think with fiction, I was actually talking to Lizzie Pook, who is also a journalist, and she's also published fiction. And the thing that just goes against your DNA as a journalist is it's just making stuff up.
Yes.
So you're like, but this isn't true. And your entire career has been obviously, as a journalist, led by truth and fact and research and all of that. And then when you sort of just have to like pull something out of thin air, that you really have to, I think, overcome this this feeling that you're misleading people, I think, somehow.
Yes.
That's the whole point. You're supposed to be actually creating something and getting people to believe in it. So
but do you also feel that for good fiction you have to sort of give more of yourself than, whereas with non-fiction you can keep it all kind of quite straight?
Well, so I mean, I think increasingly, and I know we'll get into this, but in the same way that there's definitely been a rise of a type of journalism where you're expected to, like, we're expected these days, everything that you write, has to have your own like experience, nailed into it. Otherwise, God forbid you could write a lifestyle feature. So I think that with nonfiction, unfortunately, like maybe if you were doing, something that's historical or just something so far removed from your own life. But I think for a lot of journalists, it is a very natural extension to write something nonfiction that's a subject that is really personal to you. So you still do put a bit of your own self into it, I think. But
yeah, fascinating. Right, so I think I'm going to hand you back to Eva now. So here we go.
Now, apologies.
No, not at all. Thanks so much, Eva. Thank you.
I just couldn't see you all, so Poorna, apologies for that. So I've missed some of what Alison said in her introduction. So have you already sort of shared some of Poorna's background?
No, we haven't really. I was going to leave that to you, so you can do the big build up.
No, thanks, Alison, and thanks everyone who's taken the time to join us for this Women in Journalism event today. So Poorna is a journalist, an author, a podcaster, a broadcaster, and she's been in the industry. She doesn't look old enough. I don't believe this stat, for almost 18 years. If I'm
20, I'm
reading,
afraid this year. Yeah.
nearly 20 years. And in that time, she's award-winning. She is a former UK executive editor and global lifestyle head for the Huffington Post. Her articles have appeared in so many publications, including, I'm just selecting a few here, The Times, the iPaper, the Grazia, The Guardian, Red Magazine, Stylist, and many, many more. Poorna specializes in women's issues, diversity, fitness, and mental health, among others. And in addition to all that, she's an accomplished public speaker and broadcaster who has featured on Channel 5, ITV, BBC News, and she's a regular fixture on BBC Radio. So we're so delighted, Poorna, that you've even managed to find the time to join us today.
Thank you. Thank you. That was such a gorgeous intro. And of course, I wish that I'd had something like this when I was sort of starting out in journalism. So it's a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And so today, as we know, it's in conversation, and it's just going to be a really, hopefully really insightful, but overall relaxed conversation with Poorna about her career, her entry, how she got into journalism, and just some key highlights from her career, and also her books and her publishing, her media amazingness to date. So I'm really excited to get into the conversation with you today. So first off, I want to start off by finding, and I love asking this question to fellow journalists, but how did you, what was your journey into journalism? Why did you choose journalism as a career, and what were you hoping to achieve from it?
I mean, as with these things, I started thinking about, those early days and those early years. And so when even when you did that introduction of what I've done in my career so far, it just, in some ways, even though it's been nearly 20 years, I still sometimes feel like I'm that person who was just starting out thinking that it was never going to happen, And definitely I would say for the first sort of 4 to 5 years of my career, if not more, I just thought it was never really going to happen for me. And I thought that there were just places that I would never write for and so on. So I hope that what we discuss maybe helps, if anyone's listening to this or watching it, wondering the same. I hope that does help a little bit. So I think at the beginning of my career, I didn't know if I wanted to go into broadcast or actual, written journalism. And so I think, if I'm being perfectly frank, it was mainly because broadcast journalism is so much more competitive and so much harder to get into. And I don't really know that I loved it the same way. Like, I've always been a writer. Writing is something that I've loved since I was a child. So, from it being a natural kind of skill set point of view, I kind of gravitated more towards the writing side of things. But as anyone who started out in journalism knows, it's not as simple as going out there and getting a job, and no one wanted to give me a job. So, I mean, even, an unpaid internship. And I don't come from a family that works in media. There were no connections that way, didn't go to private school. And so I was lucky enough that when I was at university, how like when you hang out with your mates and their relatives or their friends from like other places come and visit, and then you go on a night out. And a friend's cousin, who was a bit older than us, basically started working for, it was a South Asian kind of based newspaper. And she just said, look, I've started working there. Why don't you come and do work experience?
Wow.
And so I was just really grateful for the opportunity. And I did work experience, and I just, worked my socks off, and then basically sort of like segued and just harangued and harassed them into giving me, a job, which just did not pay it just did not pay anything.
Was that your first? Was that your first job?
This was my first job. Yes, it was as a sort of news reporter for this really niche, really tiny newspaper, right? And I think what happened was, so basically, especially when you're that junior, no one really gives you any responsibility. Maybe like the news in brief that are like tiny little, snippets of news. And I was still not 100% sure whether journalism was for me. And then I don't know if you remember this story, but basically it was a huge story at the time, but it was the sort of the, I can't remember the exact name of the space shuttle, but the sort of the first Indian female astronaut, Poorna, she died, and I wrote her profile. And I remember sort of doing the research for that profile, and I remember writing and just being so inspired by her story, you know, because I had to find out like what her upbringing was and all of that. And that just changed something for me in terms of what storytelling could be, and that it's not always just, you know, straight news, that you could actually tell stories in a way that could really change people's perceptions of things, could change your perception of yourself. And that just sort of, I think the, you know, the sort of the part of me that has always wanted to write stories that reflect especially marginalized communities, like that began very, very, very early on. And so, yeah, that was my introduction into journalism.
Wow.
Yeah.
So a lot of perseverance there. I think that's a lesson that people
Oh my
take.
God,
Perseverance, keep knocking on those doors, and sometimes an opportune moment will come up, and then, as you've demonstrated, when the opportunity does come, you seize it, and you really work your socks off. I'm just curious, actually, Paul, in terms of how receptive were your family when you sort of shared with them that you wanted to go into journalism? Was it something that they were receptive to? Was it something new for them? How did they take it?
Oh yeah, I mean, it was never an issue. It was never a problem. It was always a given that, you know, I mean, I was terrible at maths and science, so becoming a doctor, which is such a classic stereotype for a South Asian person, was never like, that was never going to be the route.
They knew that wasn't happening, so they didn't bother to put you under any pressure.
Yeah. So, and also my parents are just not like that. You know, they would never, and my sister, who is also a journalist, but she works definitely more in the kind of like science and medical sphere of things. But they've never been the type of people to say, this is what you should do, or we want you to do this. And I think that we've always been very grateful for that. Like, we've always been allowed to pursue our careers in a way that we've wanted to. And, you know, although, don't get me wrong, like, I've been freelance for, I want to say 5 years, and my mum still says, like, you know, you sure you don't want to get like a permanent job? Like, she says it every year.
Even when you're publishing books, your books coming out, she still,
it's immaterial to her. She, like, it's like it doesn't sink in. She just, as you know, she would just, I think, sleep better at night if she thought I was working 9 to 5 at a company somewhere, but that's not going to happen. So apart from that, she's very happy.
Amazing. That's such an inspirational story, and sharing that that message of how you persevere and how you got into the industry. I won't ask you what you got paid 20 years ago.
Oh, I could tell you.
What you want to tell us?
It was 10K.
Yeah, when I got my first job in local papers around, oh my God, longer than you, maybe about 25 years ago, and I got paid, I think it was about 9,000.
Yeah.
And I thought I'd hit the jackpot for it. I thought, my God, I arrived in journalism. I thought it was like such a huge sum of money at the time. But thank you for sharing that part of your story. So I want to go on to talk a bit more about your career, which has spanned the digital space, print, magazines, newspapers, books, and broadcasting. So what we're seeing now is more people just, traditionally you would sort of maybe work on a newspaper and stay there for 25 years, or go to the BBC and just be a lifer. But it sounds like more people are doing this sort of multi-hyphenated careers, doing lots of different things. I think sometimes it's called portfolio careers as well. So as someone who has done that really successfully, what are the benefits and some of the downsides?
So I would say, my kind of impression of journalism as an industry is that it, even across 2 decades, it just hasn't necessarily changed as much. And by that, I mean, in terms of pay, in terms of who the gatekeepers are around, decision-making, senior management, all of that kind of stuff. And so the benefit of having, a lot of like different other areas that you excel in is that, number one, I think it is an incredibly good thing for your creativity, because I think that while writing is obviously the main thing that I love and enjoy, you know, journalism, the journalism that I do is only one type of writing, and that there is like a lot of joy, I think, and fulfillment to be had from other types of writing. So for example, with books, it's there are good and bad points of writing books, but the sort of the joy that I generate for myself through writing books, it far outstrips any other type of writing that I tend to do. Maybe beyond, you know, writing columns or pieces, you know, for papers or sites where it sort of resonates with a lot of people. And I also think that what it does is it gives you a bit more autonomy, and it gives you a bit more power in terms of how you're controlling the path of your own career. And again, when you are very dependent on, you know, whether or not another person, and you know, if you sort of, for anyone that works in senior management will know that it's not just about whether your immediate boss says yes or no. That person then reports into so many other people, and there are so many decisions that are made at a business level that impacts you, that you have like zero control, to be quite frank, over most of it. So I think it definitely gives you a lot more autonomy and control over the pathway that you're going down. And I think sometimes that's a really, really important thing, even when you're looking at it from a mental health point of view. But also I think, you know, for example, like I started out as a print journalist because that was the time, and online journalism was literally something that only started to come in maybe when I was about like 4 years into my career. And I knew that like I was okay at print journalism, but like there were so many other people that seemed to be so much better than me. And I was just thinking, I don't really know that I'm going to get very far in this. I feel like I'm kind of terrible at it, to be honest. And then when I made the switch into digital journalism, I was like, oh my God, I'm really good at this. And I know that that sounds like such an arrogant thing to say, but what I mean by that is I really like the stuff that I love about digital journalism is the quickness of it, the originality of thinking, the ability to work alongside new and emerging technologies, the fact that you can be innovative, that the hierarchy isn't as like, you know, stagnant as it is in certain aspects of print. The things that you can just do, like the way that you package up content. And also like when I was, you know, I was a senior manager, right, at HuffPost, like when you then expand that and you work across other areas of business, like I loved that. I loved working with the commercial team. I loved being able to strategize. And that was something that I was actually really, really good at doing. And it's something that I never would have known or never would have tapped into if I had stayed in print journalism. So that's why personally, I feel it's really important to diversify.
And in terms of sort of moving from or working on the commercial side, a lot of journalists tend to, as you say, stay in the editorial, but some of the commercial world opened up. How did that happen, and how did you embrace this, and how can others also do that?
I mean, it's not for everyone, because I think that, you know, it depends on the type of commercial team you're working with. It depends on what type of journalism you do. You know, like an investigative journalist is going to have zero interest, for example, in terms of working alongside commercial. For me, it's something that I personally find really interesting. And the reason why I find it interesting is because what is happening commercially in a country, like, so if it's in a company, so for example, one thing I would say from having worked and managed journalists as well as worked alongside journalists is that while I think it's really important in any company for the journalists to be like the people who protect your editorial integrity and your editorial standards, it's really, really important that they do that, because in any company that has a commercial function, you know, those two things sometimes are at odds. And if you don't have integrity, then you don't have anything really. However, that insistence on holding on to that sometimes means that they can be, you know, blockers basically for how you leverage your content and how you make it more commercially successful. And the thing that no one really likes to hear is your commercial team is what's bringing your money in. It's what allows you to do what you're doing. And I would see this like day in and day out, this refusal amongst people to just acknowledge that and to kind of absorb that. And also just being aware of what's going on in your company. You know, where are those restructures taking place? Like what departments seem to be making smaller? Like if you're overtaken by a large parent company, like what is their track record in terms of when they've made cuts before? It's all stuff like that And to be honest, I learned all of this stuff on the job. You know, no one kind of sits you down and tells you this. And I think that it's a really healthy thing for me anyway, to know like advertising isn't something that happens, you know, out there in the nebula. Like it's advertising is also a part of how we storytell. You know, it also influences people. It closes the gap around, you know, inequities that take place. So it's a very powerful tool. And I think that personally, there's a lot that could be done in terms of how you leverage your commercial teams to work in a way where you get your own agenda through, where you can still make a difference and you can make your points through. And I think that's the thing that really interested me about that.
Thank you, Poorna. One of the things you said in one of your previous answers was that what gives you the most satisfaction is now your book writing. It's just something that gives you such joy. So I just want to know, how did you sort of make that transition into, especially fiction writing, because your newest book is your debut fiction novel. So how did you make that transition into fiction, which is something, you know, most journalists we say that we've all got a book in us, but how many of us actually go on to do what you've done? So tell us a bit about how that came about.
Yeah, I mean, it's an irony, isn't it, that the thing that gives me the most joy is not the thing that my bank balance really loves, because unfortunately it's just, you know, it's the thing that I love doing the most. But you know, if I'm being, and I'm very honest about all of this stuff, is that it just, unless you are a best-selling, super successful author, it's just not the thing that's gonna, you know, pay your bills. What I would say is that the transition, to be quite frank, from journalism to writing fiction wouldn't have happened if I hadn't done nonfiction. So I think it's really important. I know I sort of was chatting to Alison about this a little bit at the beginning, but like I would never have had really the confidence to move straight into fiction writing from journalism. So journalists that I know that have done that, I'm very impressed, because there is a sort of sense of imposter syndrome around like, well, oh, little old me, could I possibly write fiction? And I think also a huge part of that has got to do, if I'm being frank, with, I think, this idea of this sort of stereotype of who we think a fiction writer is. Right. And it's like, you know, sitting around, like having loads of time and, you know, being able to just type you as like you know, the spirit compels you. And actually it's not like that at all. Like and I think that it's important to say, if there is anyone watching this wondering if, you know, oh, I couldn't possibly move into fiction writing, is the things that make you a good journalist are actually probably the things that will make you a good fiction writer, because there is no muse that moves you. It's basically about deadlines and discipline. Right. And we know that stuff like inside out, right? So for me, for example, someone just said, well, what do you do if you sit at your desk and you can't think of anything? And I was like, that has literally never happened to me ever. Can you imagine, like, as a journalist, like you wouldn't eat. So it's like, well, I just said that's just not how I've been trained. So actually you already have those skills. It's a different medium and it's a different way of writing. And so I think if you can overcome, I was saying this to Alison at the beginning, if you can overcome the sense of, it feels very wrong. It felt very wrong to me at the beginning, because I just thought I'm just literally making stuff up and like passing it off as a story. And that's so counterintuitive to being a journalist when you're, you know, entirely led by the truth, right? But I just think that if you can kind of overcome that, and if you can, I mean, structure, if you can have a think about like what your plot's going to be, like we've trained for this kind of stuff like our entire careers, all of that stuff will just hold you in good stead. But it literally is about, I think, setting yourself a deadline and keeping to your own deadlines, and to also understand that actually, you know, I think a lot of people get stuck when they just think, oh my God, but this is so exposing. And what if people, you know, read it and think it's a bunch of rubbish? And I definitely felt that with my first fiction, because I just thought it's just different to what I've written before. And I very purposefully wrote, you know, it's modern women's fiction, but I very purposefully wrote something that would sit in the genre of commercial literature. And I think when we talk as journalists and when we talk among us, like we're all expecting a literary book, right? We're all expecting like a book that should be, I don't know, the next Booker Prize or whatever it is. And the reality is that, and I think sometimes we do this to ourselves, you know, when I talk to my peers and so on, is that there is this sense that you kind of need to impress each other, or there's this sort of latent sense of, you know, snobbery that we have amongst each other, you know. And I just feel like if you can kind of just relinquish that, just literally write something that you would be proud of, and something that very crucially that you would want to read, that it doesn't really matter what other journalists think of your writing. It doesn't really matter what other people think of your writing, you know, because there will be people that will love your writing regardless of it. You just can't please everyone. And I think that that's a really important thing to let go of personally.
And do you feel much more relaxed in that sense now? Do you feel that you've managed to shake off some of that imposter syndrome, and you feel more confident in writing, and not, you know, not worrying so much about what your peers and others think? Do you feel that you've managed to do that, or are you still slightly anxious sometimes?
I mean, I think that I will always care. Like, I think, and, you know, so let's say if I'm sort of finishing up my second fiction, of course, there's a massive part of me that's like, oh my God, I hope this isn't a giant turkey, and I hope that people like it. But you know, after sort of I published my first fiction last year, I just had an absolute meltdown, because I just got so in my head about what people must be thinking about it, you know, how well I perceived it would do, and then didn't do, or that I couldn't see the good things that had happened as a consequence of publishing it, or I couldn't see the people that had positive things to say about it. And I would say that having some distance from, you know, that time, I definitely look back and I think I care less about the importance or the validation of what certain people feel about it. Mainly also because I think when I look back at my body of work, I'm really proud of my body of work. Like, it is actually, I was like thinking this the other week, in terms of like, I was beating myself up about something, you know, and I just was thinking, oh, this bit of writing I've done is really bad and blah, blah, blah. And then I just thought, but actually I've got quite a diverse body of work. And so of course, like, no one piece is gonna read exactly the same, or be exactly the same, because it's not meant to speak to every single person. So yes, I have gotten better at it, but yeah, I still probably care too much about what other people think.
And sometimes I guess you do have to remind yourself. I think it's easy to just sort of think about the negative side of things, and think about, you know, the criticism. Actually, as you said, reminding yourself that actually, regardless of what anyone says, you're a published author with 4 books, and not many people can say that. So remind ourselves of the reason to be
Thank you.
proud of ourselves as well. But Poorna, I want to talk about some of the subjects that you write about. You frequently write about mental health, and you write about diversity issues, which are areas that you've touched upon as being very passionate and very important to you. So, in terms of journalism, do you feel that it's getting better, or where it needs to be when it comes to addressing those 2 issues in terms of mental health and diversity?
I mean, I don't want to be too harsh about this, because I do think that there are some organizations who are making changes, or, you know, and I do understand that change doesn't happen overnight, and that it's a slow process. And I do know that, you know, I mean, depending on the company you work for, there are initiatives around like looking after your mental health, and, you know, some companies will offer free healthcare that means that you can access counseling and all of that stuff. What I will say is that that stuff isn't consistent. Like, it very much depends on the company that you're working for, and so you have to hope that when you're applying for a job, that, you know, you're supported by a company in those ways. As an industry, I would say no, I don't think it's really gotten that much better at diversity. You know, we still sit, for example, if you're looking, I think it's the NCTJ, I feel like the report came out this last year, where, for example, 94% of journalists, let's say if you look at race, are white. A lot of that is skewed because, you know, the bulk of journalism is based in places like London, and London, you know, when you look at diversity levels, aren't representative of diversity levels around the country. So they're skewed in terms of, so that number, that 94% might be even bigger, to be quite frank. And if you then like layer on things like, you know, the sort of percentage of people that went to, you know, private school, for example, versus those who didn't, I just don't know how much that's changing. And the big thing that I would say around that is, especially because this is the thing that I feel really strongly about, is what is happening at a senior leadership level, because I kind of feel like all of these schemes and initiatives and mentorships and whatnot are put out there, which is great. But it also, to me, seems to be quite cynically a smoke and mirrors from, okay, so what is actually happening with the leadership of a company, and what are the commitments that are happening around that to address that? And I'm not really hearing very much of that. And I think we can't even seem to have like the conversation, because, you know, if you start having the conversation with people, you know, you kind of get pushed back by people saying, well, it's about best person for the job. And I'm like, yeah, cool, I do believe in best person for the job, I do believe that things should be earned, but we don't live in an equal society. So what is the solution there around recruitment and around things like that, in terms of addressing that?
Mhm.
Yeah,
And,
sorry.
no, it's not for you to answer, but have you got any thoughts as to how journalism could be more diverse and could be better? I mean, for instance, when I got into journalism, it's so interesting that I'd never met anyone from public school. It was very, I guess, maybe working class, you could call it. It was just very, so I felt very comfortable in that kind of working class space. I didn't feel like I was entering in a space that was, you know, full of Oxbridge and private school people. But I think it feels like now it seems to, it's my perception that it feels more dominated by that now. And maybe it was just different because I was in print, and broadcasting I think is very different. But so yeah, I didn't encounter anyone from public school for a very long time. But what do you think needs to kind of happen to change all of that in terms of the diversity of our journalism?
I mean, I think that there are moves that are happening. Like, I've definitely noticed, for example, when I see, like, I always look at, you know, bylines and things like that, and I always find, especially like emerging or new journalists to follow on Instagram, and to keep my kind of hand in that. And I have definitely noticed that there is more diversity of thought and diversity of backgrounds, in terms of let's say, even if you're commissioning out and you're hiring freelancers. But I just don't know that it changes unless you change the workforce. And I did consultancy at a company recently which really reminded me of the blind spots that just exist when you don't have people of certain backgrounds in the room. And I'm not even talking about at a senior level, I'm talking about like even at a mid-management level. And so that was a real rude awakening for me, because I thought, okay, well, I've been out of companies for about 4 or 5 years, like maybe things have changed. And to kind of be sitting in those rooms over and over again, thinking people aren't even thinking about like the basic thing, because there is no one there to point that out to them, or to kind of offer that as a viewpoint. And so it comes back to recruitment. I don't really know that I have a solution around that. And, you know, there are very, like, everyone's got their own kind of school of thought around it. But I, like, for example, you know, like in terms of my career, I have never been given a job by a white man, like, ever. It's always been a woman, or it's been a person of color. So if I'm saying that, like, after a 20-year career, and I'm still going back into these companies and saying that as a consultant, I don't really think that things are changing as quickly as they need to be. And I still don't know that when those changes are implemented, that they are implemented from a place that doesn't come from guilt, or, oh, we want to be seen to be doing the right thing. I kind of have to still be convinced around that, I'm afraid.
And in terms of, thanks, Poorna, in terms of the approach and attitude in terms of well-being and mental health, have you seen a shift in that? Does that paint a better picture, or is that hasn't moved as far as you're concerned?
I mean, I think it's shifted in terms of, because of the general shift around mental health. I think that because of that, the conversations that we've been having in the general public consciousness around mental health, I think people are just much more aware. I do remember, like, for the first, I would say, 10 years or so of my career as a journalist, everything about how our working days were structured had an enormously detrimental effect on my mental health. And I would say that that would be anything ranging from the type of pressure that you're under, to the hours that you have to work, to not being able to vocalize like how you might be feeling about things, because you just get penalized or shouted at by your managers, basically, which I don't really think, you know, in today's world of HR, I don't know that people get away with that anymore, but that definitely was my experience. But I would say that if things are changing, it is because we are more aware of a society around our mental health, and we can advocate for ourselves around our mental health. Do I think that we as an industry value mental health? I'm not sure that we do. And again, sorry to quote this, but like this company, this was a massive company that I did consulting for recently. Most of the people that I came across were under inordinate amounts of stress and pressure, and felt like they couldn't do anything to change it, and were literally like surviving like day to day. And during my career, when I worked in companies in journalism, I don't know that I really had a day in my career when I didn't feel like that, to be quite frank.
No, you know, everything you're saying resonates. When I think back, you know, especially being a younger journalist, and you think of the long hours you work, and the sort of,
Yeah,
you just think, I look back and I think, God, how did I do that? I feel like I could never do that now. But you're right. So it's interesting to hear you say that the people that you speak to now, they still feel that there's still that pressure that goes on. And I think it's also in an industry where, especially in print journalism, where you know, there are cuts, and journalists are you know, losing their jobs. It's often the people who are left behind, who are completely, you know, you're now doing the job of 2 or 3 other reporters. And especially in the digital space as well, I can imagine, Poorna, that pressure just to churn out that copy and get it out as well. There's just so much pressure there as well.
I mean, especially in the digital space, I don't know a single company where you don't start your working week with like a list of all of the stats that have come from the previous week. And the sort of fear that kind of creates is, I mean, I can feel it in my stomach at the moment. It makes me feel sick, because you know that like by the end of next week, you that's what your week is going to be dictated by, right? Like trying to get those figures up. And I mean, the thing is, it's not necessarily like, you know, because I don't want this to be overly negative about this. This isn't necessarily like journalism as a whole. It's the fact that very often, you know, there are people, for example, who are promoted to being managers who aren't actually supposed to be managers. And so people may not have the skill set to like deal with, you know, their employees who are struggling with things. And also, you're like one human being, like you can only do as much as you can. Like if you're not supported by your company's infrastructure, if there isn't resource there, what can you as like one solitary manager, you know, do against all of that? So it isn't just something that's within an issue within journalism. It's in a lot of other industries as well. But I would still say that the pressure seems to be on the individual versus the actual companies in terms of supporting around it.
And do you think that people who are in these positions and are feeling pressure, do you think, you know, I think people are worried about, you know, if they vocalize things to their manager or vocalize, you know, they might be penalized. But do you think that we're in a space now that it's okay to say, look, I'm not okay, there's too much pressure? And do you think that managers in journalism as a whole are a bit more receptive to that now?
I mean, I'm not sure how accurately I can answer that, because I'm just not, I sort of took myself out of management because I just got to a space where while I think there were parts of it that I really enjoyed, I just don't really, I felt like it was getting in the way of other stuff, to be frank. But I do think that some companies are creating a better space and a safer space for people to be able to do that. But I do think overall people are worried about, you know, if they vocalize like that that they're struggling with something, whether they will be selected, like will that be used to penalize them when it comes to their end of year appraisal and so on. But again, I don't think that this is just a journalism issue. I think that we do have this in a lot of other industries. And that could be, I don't, and again, I'm not saying that, you know, people are not handling this internally in companies because they're bad people. I just think it depends on what that pressure is like coming from the top down. And that's what I mean about there needing to be like, and when I say diversity, I don't just mean race, I mean like neurodivergency, you know, ability, disability, anything that allows people to just think in a way that isn't quite as rigid and conservative as the sort of worlds that we've been used to having to like come up in, where it's either you do it or you don't. Like, I don't think that those should be the options. I think that actually there is space for softness in journalism. And I think that to be honest, I think that there has to be space for softness in journalism. Otherwise, you're just not, I don't really know that the way in which we work is sustainable, you know. I mean, it's not sustainable because I'm speaking as someone who is proof of the fact that working in journalism is not sustainable, because while I work in it, I could never see myself going back into an office job as a consequence of it.
Thank you. Poorna, you've shared some very personal events in your life with readers, and I'm interested to know, have you found this helpful and empowering to do that, or have there been times that you've maybe regretted letting the outside world into your world? And so I'd like to also know, how do you suggest that other writers write about their own lives and personal experiences, but also kind of protect themselves from too much interest from the outside world?
Yeah, I mean, it's such an interesting one, because we were talking about this in relation to people who write memoirs, right? Like, but like, let's say if we look at journalism specifically, I do think it's an issue that we seem to have gotten to a point where if you are writing a lifestyle feature in journalism and you're being commissioned, it seems to nowadays be, oh God, nowadays, I sound like I'm 1,000 years old.
In the old days, Poorna, it wasn't like that.
Days, yeah. But these days, I find that everything has to be rooted in your own experience. And I think that you could write a brilliant feature and it doesn't have to necessarily be you carving some really deeply personal, painful thing to like give it legitimacy. I just don't think it does. However, if you do write about your own stuff, I mean, I never really used to, and yeah, I did definitely do that, but that was for very personal reasons, and it was because I was finding it really unbearable in my own life to not connect. Like, the reason why I started writing was because I wanted to connect with people and I wanted to educate people, because I felt that, you know, when there are a lot of things around mental health, for example, where there are enormous stigmas, I felt like if people who knew a bit more, then maybe they wouldn't have such, you know, ignorant takeaways around certain things. But also it was easier to write it from a personal point of view, because I don't necessarily know at that point in time, from a journalism point of view, we were really doing much in the way of mental health. Like, it was still a very early conversation, right? What I would say is that I don't think that there's anything I've ever regretted around that. I mean, there is, like, you know, there are features, for example, I've written where I've maybe had a certain viewpoint around something that I've regretted, but writing about my personal life, I don't think so. I would say, however, that not everything has to be written. So, and also definitely I would say for younger journalists to have a think about how you might feel about that piece of information about you being out there in the open. So when I was at HuffPost and I was managing, I had a really young journalist who came up to me, who was going through a really bad time, who basically wanted to write about their experience with depression, right? And I spoke to them about it, but and obviously it was their choice, and I can't remember whether they wrote something or not. This wasn't someone I was directly managing, because, you know, it shouldn't be the case of the world, but people do sometimes discriminate, you know, if you're writing about problems that you're having with your mental health. You know, it would be disingenuous of me to say that people shouldn't, that people don't when they're doing hiring. And also how you may feel about that information being out there about you in 5 or 10 years. You may not feel that way in that time, but also crucially, why are you writing it is, I think, a really important question that people should ask themselves. You know, are you writing it because you are someone who is going through pain and you need to offload this pain, and writing as a catharsis and a way to do that? In which case, my advice would be that maybe the best thing to do would be to, if you have access to it, to talk to a therapist, to talk to a friend, to talk to a counselor, talk to someone if you feel like you're not being heard. But to also say that sometimes, you know, personal, like writing about your experiences can be immeasurably powerful, and it can make you realize that you're not alone, and that actually possibly there are lots of other people that might think and feel the way that you do. And the sort of the benefit and the power of that can be enormous. But I would say it's important to be considered before you do that.
And in terms of some of the upsides of that, so, you know, sharing personal stories, I can imagine that, you know, it's so relatable to so many people and so helpful to others. So it'd be good to hear about when you are contacted by readers or someone who's read your work, and how it feels to sort of have touched someone's life in that way. But also on the flip side of that, then we do live in this digital era of trolls and people just writing all these horrible things online. So it'd be interesting to know how you cope with that sort of online, if you've had any trolling, and also how you cope with that.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that I don't know if so when I published like my first ever kind of personal piece, I was absolutely terrified that it would just get loads of trolls. But actually the journalist in me was like, no, actually the worst thing would be if no one read it. And then
Spoken like a journalist, Poorna.
I know. And then that piece that I wrote went viral, and then I didn't get any trolls. Actually, what I got was just loads and loads of incredible messages from people that helped me enormously at that time, and connected me to a community that I didn't know was there. Now, am I saying that that happens to everyone else? Of course it doesn't. You know, there, for example, there are friends of mine who work in the body positive space who have to deal with the most atrocious trolling. So I don't know that there's like I don't think there's kind of a template for how you avoid trolls. I just know that you know, what I tend to do is I am very considered about the information that I put out there. I'm considered about how I frame it. So I try and frame it in a way that's not like you know, purposely necessarily divisive. Like, oh, and if I am being divisive, I will try and back myself into why I've like said something like that. But generally I don't really get trolls. And I think that what I do get, which is something that I have appreciated, is I will just get messages from people who are either like have important things to say, or they need some comfort or whatever. And someone once said to me, you know, oh God, but doesn't it get really overwhelming? And sometimes, like, you know, yeah, it can get a bit much, but then I just sort of take myself away and I don't reply to those messages. But also I think that if it doesn't feel, I don't give anything that I'm not willing to give. So I don't overstretch myself in a way that means that my cup is empty. So if someone wants to have a conversation with me, if someone's in pain around something, then I have the capacity to meet that. You know, it's important, I think, to know where your own energy levels are. And also you're doing this because for the best reasons, to try and have a connection with someone. Like, you don't owe anyone any more than you're already giving, I think.
Brilliant, thank you. Something that I don't know how many people know this about you, Poorna, but you are a power lifter. You have a whole life in powerlifting, and so I'd like to hear more about it, because it's another, you know, I just love the way that you know, you take your life and your journey in so many different directions. So how did you get into that, and how has it impacted your life, and are there any similarities with journalism?
I mean, that is a whole different event.
That's a whole other seminar. That's a whole different conversation.
Yeah, what I will say is that it's really positively impacted my life in terms of, I think, walking into spaces and being in the room with other people and holding my own and feeling confident about myself. That is definitely something, you know, I remember sort of when I was sort of starting to get interested in it. You know, when like in the job that I did, you know, I would very often be the only woman in the room, and I definitely would be the only woman of color in the room. And I think what it did at the very beginning was just make me feel like I could own the space that I'm in and just like hold my space. But yeah, and it's also something
stronger. Was it because you felt physically empowered? Not that you were going to sort of arm wrestle someone in the room, but was that because you felt physically? What do you think it did to you? How did it give you that confidence?
I think because before I did it, I had always been like quite, so for example, even if you look at something like the gym, right? Like, you know, the free weight section or the weight section of a gym is something that, despite being someone who was otherwise a very confident person, that section of the gym scared the crap out of me. And I would not go into it and I would just avoid it. And I just remember thinking, but there's no other space that I would feel like this about. And I think that what it just does is, I think like as women, you're so conditioned, you're so socially conditioned to take up as little space as possible, that I hadn't noticed that I shrink myself, or I would shrink myself in, you know, certain scenarios. And I think the reason why it just made me expand and feel like I could kind of hold my own is because that particular type of activity, number one, yes, you do feel very physically strong within yourself, but you're also building something and you're working towards something which is about, it's something that you've created yourself. Like no one can take that away from you. Like a colleague can't take that away from you. Your friends and family can't. And there is something that's very grounding in and very reassuring in that knowledge.
And did your colleagues know that you were sort of entering this world and doing this? Were they sort of thinking twice before when they were speaking to you?
No. No, I don't think it was anything like that. I think it was more just they found it really amusing, and it was something that just ended up being a really lovely conversation that I would start to have with people, because people are really interested in it and want to ask you questions about it. Yeah, so no, they were very supportive.
And are you still very active? Is it still quite a big part of your life?
It is, yeah. I mean, I would say that, you know, I wrote a book about it. I wrote like a nonfiction book about it, and it has become part of my journalism. So it definitely, I think for me, it's something that I kind of just want to give to every woman, because I feel like it's not just about feeling strong. I feel like it undoes a lot of other like really negative narratives that we kind of have about ourselves, and things that feel quite self-defeating, because sometimes working and being in this world can be an exhausting thing. And I think that anything that just allows you to feel better in your own body, more like yourself, something that you can rely on that exists within yourself, I think is a good thing.
And so you would definitely encourage more women to take this up?
Oh, I mean, if I could get every single person to do it, I would. I would. Because
I'm coming to the gym with you next time.
yeah, like every single friend that I've ever taken to do this always goes, oh, I don't know if I can do it, I don't know if I can lift anything, and then they will like leave with like a massive smile on their face, because they will just end up doing much more than they thought that they were capable of doing.
I've tried to lift those, I don't know if they're what they call those little piddly ones, and even then I'm like, I can't imagine, you know, taking it
That's
to a higher
okay.
level.
You just build it up. Yeah.
Start somewhere. Thank you for that. And so this is the last question we have for you, because it feels like we've been speaking only for 5 minutes, but it's been almost an hour. So this is the last question, and it's just wanted to know if there's one thing that you feel that you've achieved from your career. What do you feel has been your biggest achievement? And for those listening and struggle to feel that they are achieving things or achieving what they set out to achieve, what would your advice be to them?
I mean, I don't know that I have a snappy answer. I would say that in our industry, especially, it can sometimes feel really hard, because I think we compare ourselves to where our peers are. And sometimes that can, and if we're not quite there yet, if we haven't achieved the things that we think that we should have done, it can be really destabilizing. And especially because we live in a society that has milestones, around certain ages and so on. And the only thing that I can really say is I never, ever, ever in a million years ever thought that I would have the career that I currently have. And it still feels unreal when I sometimes think about the career that I've had. And the only thing that I can just say is just to keep going, to try and connect with people who can advocate for you, but advocate for yourself where you can. Like there are so many times in my career where I just kind of like accepted what was being told to me, or I just accepted an impression that someone had of me and kind of just didn't really do anything about it. And I wish that there had been points at which, I mean, I advocate for myself pretty hard, as I'm sure you Oh, but there are parts where I wish I had advocated for myself in certain circumstances when I hadn't. But the one thing I will say is it will happen. If you can get a mentor or get someone who is in the industry who can help you overcome your imposter syndrome about it. And if there is anything that you want to do, don't let anyone talk you out of doing it just because they don't happen to see you in that role. Like forget that. Just keep going and keep grafting, and you'll get there in the end. Even if it seems like you will never get there in the end, trust me.
No, that is amazing advice, and I definitely would echo that. I think so often, but you know, it comes with confidence. But when you're not fully confident, you know, it's hard to kind of keep going or try and do something that you think might be impossible. So it's amazing. I think it's such sound advice, Poorna, and I just think it's been lovely listening to your story. Very, very humbling, very low key about all you've achieved. I'm like, this is like incredible what you've done, but your energy is just really positive, but really sort of low key and humble with it. So I think that's something we can all take.
Thank you
so thank you so much. I just wanted to share, if you want to follow anyone on Twitter, you can follow Women in Journalism at WIJ. You can follow Poorna. Do you want to share your Twitter handle?
Yeah, so Twitter or Instagram is at Poorna Bell, and that's it.
And I'm at Eva M Simpson, and yeah, follow, share, do all those amazing things that happen in the digital space. So thank you so much. Poorna, you are a typical journalist. You've hit your deadline. We've finished bang on time. So well done. You still got it, girl. Still got it.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you so much for everyone who joined us today. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Have a good rest of the day. Bye.